Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was murdered after a visit to a cinema on Friday, February 28, 1986 at 11:21 p.m. With a single revolver shot, Sweden was forever changed. For nearly 40 years, no theory about who fired the murder weapon has been convincing, until now. It appears that once again, the simplest explanation, most likely, is the correct one. The decision to go to the cinema that evening had been made at the last minute. On the afternoon of February 28th, Lisbeth Palme mentioned the potential movie outing to her colleagues and later discussed it with her son Morten Palme's fiancée. Olof Palme, who typically dismissed his bodyguards at the end of the workday, did the same that Friday. He only learned of the movie plans when he arrived home at 6:30 p.m. He had dinner with his wife Lisbeth and made a few phone calls. After a phone call with his son Morten, who had already bought the tickets, the couple decided around 8 p.m. to join. Around 8:30 p.m., the couple left their apartment and walked to the subway station, where they took a train departing at 8:42. They got off at their stop about 5 minutes later and walked to the Grand Cinema. The police investigation that followed showed no signs of phone tapping or surveillance from their home to the cinema. Just before 9 p.m., they met their son Morten and his fiancée. Olof Palme bought tickets at the counter for Suzanne Austen's comedy, The Mozart Brothers. Olof Palme had gotten the impression that the film started at 9 p.m. and thought they were running late. However, upon checking their tickets, they realized the film actually began at 9:15 p.m., making them early instead. As they waited, they stood outside the entrance, chatting, clearly visible and audible to anyone passing by. After the movie ended, between 11:05 and 11:10 p.m., the four stood outside the cinema. When the crowd dispersed and the sidewalk became empty, Morten Palme noticed a lone man at a store window intensely watching his parents with a fixed stare. The man was tall, bulky, and slightly stooped. He was wearing a blue or dark blue jacket, and he kept his hands in his pockets. His eyelids drooped beneath his eyebrows as he watched Olof Palme while the group chatted. A little later, around 11:15 p.m., the two groups parted ways. Morten Palme and his girlfriend walked north towards the man by the window, and he sensed that the man followed Olof and Lisbeth Palme, who walked south along the same street. At Adolf Fredrik's church, they crossed the street and continued their walk. Several witnesses noticed a man trailing behind the Palmes, matching Morten Palme's description of the man outside the cinema. The couple stopped at a store window at the Sari clothing shop, moving forward at a slow pace. One of the last witnesses to see the couple noticed a lone man walking about 10 meters behind them. He walked a little strangely, wore a blue jacket, and he had his hands in his pockets. At 11:21 p.m., a man sneaked up behind the couple and fired a shot into Olof Palme's back at close range. A second shot wounded Lisbeth Palme with a superficial graze along her back. However, Lisbeth Palme managed to see his face. His face had a square shape. His eyes were staring. He wore a blue jacket. After standing there a few seconds, he turned around and hobbled off into the alleyway and ran up the stairs and disappeared into the dark, narrow streets of Stockholm. The day after the murder, County Police Chief Hans Holmér, without formal decision, took over the investigation with support from the government. He failed to solve the case and resigned the following year. In the years that followed, the investigation pursued several dead ends. These included the 33-year-old, the PKK trail, the police trail, Christer Pettersson, the South Africa trail, Stay Behind, and finally, Stig Engström, the so-called Skandia man. Olof Palme's murderer left behind 2 bullets of the .357 Magnum type, made by Winchester Western. One bullet was found the morning of March 1st, on the sidewalk across the street from where the shots took place, while the other was discovered around noon the following day on the same side as the murder scene. Both bullets matched lead fragments found in Palme's clothing. As .357 Magnum ammunition is most often used with Smith & Wesson revolvers, the investigation intensified its search for such weapons, though other manufacturers like Taurus and Colt were also tested. Police have tested over 500 Magnum revolvers, and today all sought-after Smith & Wesson revolvers have been tested except for one. The owner of the only Smith & Wesson that hasn't been found belonged to a man we can call Krister A. Based on witness statements, the perpetrator is described as a man between 175 and 195 centimeters tall, wearing a long dark coat or jacket and possibly a hat, such as a cap or beanie. Witnesses described his movements as heavy, clumsy, and lumbering, but also as agile. No official documentation of Lisbeth Palme's description of the perpetrator has been made. Her descriptions emerged gradually after the murder. A perpetrator profile was created in 1993 with assistance of the FBI and presented in 1994. The profile suggested that the murder was committed by a lone individual who spotted Palme at the Grand Cinema. According to the profile, the man was likely personality disordered, a loner, aged between 30 and 50, but more likely 30 to 40, with a history of failures that may have driven him to hatred of authorities. The Commission's report was established to review the investigation into Olof Palme's murder. One suspect stands out in the report on pages 955 to 960 in the section on suspect profile number 8, also called GH, also known as Krister A. He was first questioned by the police as late as 1995, and in May 1996, the Palme investigators compiled a summary of the case, concluding with 8 key points. GH was living within comfortable walking distance from the murder scene at the time of the crime. He owned a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum with a 6-inch barrel. He was a recognized skilled marksman. He demonstrated unusually detailed knowledge about various stages of the Palme investigation. He received at least 2 summonses in 1990, but claims not to remember them. His explanation about the circumstances surrounding the sale of his weapon in 1992 is hardly credible. He claimed he was bedridden at home the days before, during, and after the murder. This is contradicted by another investigation. His appearance, posture, and manner of movement remarkably matched descriptions of Olof Palme's killer. He went from regularly attending his shooting club throughout 1985 to February 1986. After the murder on February 28, 1986, he disappeared from the club and was gone for the rest of the year. He then became a regular at a cafe with a clear view of the murder scene. According to the staff, he visited the cafe several times a week, and he continued to visit even more frequently after he sold his apartment and moved out of town. Krister A. is also almost identical to the composite sketch that Olof Palme's son, Morten Palme, created of the man he saw watching Olof Palme after the movie. By the way, if he sold the weapon in 1992, that in itself is suspicious, because as early as the spring of 1986, the news media reported on the police's interest in test firing Magnum revolvers in connection with the Palme investigation. Krister A. knew, within weeks of the murder, that he had reason to consider the possibility that the police would want to test fire his own weapon when he saw Holmér displaying a couple of revolvers on TV. The end of March 1989, Hans Olvebro announced that the police intended to test fire all registered .357 Magnum revolvers, regardless of manufacturer, in Stockholm County, and planned to start the following week. He emphasized that gun owners should wait for their summonses. By the summer of 1991, 429 weapons had been test fired, and all gun owners had received summonses. Of these, 183 weapons were eliminated from suspicion. Eventually, only 8 weapons remained of interest to the police. When the commission submitted its report in 1999, 7 of these had also been ruled out for one reason or another. The only weapon the police still wanted to test fire at that time was Krister A's revolver. Krister A claimed that the sale of his registered revolver to an unknown stranger on the street took place in 1992. 3 years after the police had sent the first summons and 3 years after telling media about test shooting everyone's Magnum revolver. Until 2024, Krister A drew little media attention in Sweden. Journalists have long tried to highlight this lead, but it has been consistently met with disinterest from both journalists and the media. Notably, leading Palme investigators have consistently regarded Krister A as the most likely perpetrator. Despite 2 foreign journalists, 1 Danish and 1 Dutch, writing several books about Krister A, no Swedish publisher has released these works in Swedish. These reporters have highlighted compelling circumstantial evidence and pointed out many similarities between Krister A and the killer, including physical appearance, behavior, walking style, and background. The unresolved questions surrounding his missing revolver continue to fuel speculation about his possible involvement. In August 2008, Krister A's story took a tragic and mysterious turn. He committed suicide shortly after police knocked on his door, following a call from his brother expressing concern about Krister's mental state. While some believe his suicide was triggered by depression and growing paranoia, others speculate that Krister A feared investigators had finally found something linking him to the crime scene in Palme's murder. His death left many questions unanswered, and for top investigators, Krister A remains the most likely suspect in the assassination of Sweden's prime minister. Despite this, in 2020, Chief Prosecutor Christer Peterson turned the investigation's focus to another suspect, Stig Engström, known as Skandia Man, who died in 2000. Engström, who had contacted the authorities the day after the murder claiming to be a witness present at the crime scene, became a suspect years later when journalists and investigators found it suspicious that no one else at the scene remembered seeing him. Although Engström claimed to have been there and even taken actions as a witness, no one else could confirm his presence. On June 10, 2020, Engström was named the main suspect in Palme's murder. Peterson asserted that the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to have warranted Engström's arrest if he were still alive. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the investigation was closed due to suspicions against Engström, a decision that sparked widespread criticism. According to a poll, only 1/5 of Swedes were convinced of Engström's guilt, while the majority remained uncertain. After the investigation ended, the case files were made available to the public, who could now examine the materials themselves. This included interview protocols and other documents, although many details were heavily censored by the police. Public frustration over how the authorities handled the information led to the formation of online groups, particularly on Facebook, pushing for the release of more data and challenging the excessive redactions in the case files. More than 130 people have confessed to the murder over the years, but all have been cleared as suspects. Although the crime was set to expire in 2011, a 2010 law change ensured that no serious crime in Sweden, like the Palme assassination, could be closed due to the statute of limitations. But the investigation continued for over 30 years without concrete results. The assassination of Olof Palme became one of the world's most extensive and expensive police investigations, perhaps the largest in history. A reward of up to 50 million kroner for information leading to a conviction of the perpetrator is still offered. So if you think you can find the murder weapon, well, you're rich.